Greetings and welcome to Word Magazine. This is Jeff Riddle. I'm the pastor of Christ Reformed Baptist Church in Louisa, Virginia. Today I'm going to go a little bit old school, and I'm just doing this podcast in an audio format. I've been told before that I have a face that was made for radio, so this will be perfect. In this episode, I want to begin a three-part series on F.H.A. Scrivener and the printed edition of the Textus Receptus of the Greek New Testament, which Scrivener compiled in 1880 and first published in 1881, and which continues to be kept in print by the Trinitarian Bible Society, and which has come to serve as the contemporary standard printed edition of the received text or the Textus Receptus of the New Testament in use by Christians all around the world. Sometimes those who are critics of the received text, they'll say, which TR? And really, for all practical purposes, there's a clear-cut answer to that. People who use the TR in the contemporary era use Scrivener's TR as it is published by the Trinitarian Bible Society. I was prompted to begin this series on Scrivener and his Greek New Testament after recently encountering another round of what seemed to me to be misinformation, both about Scrivener and the Greek New Testament he compiled and published. A few years ago, I wrote an article for the Puritan Reformed Journal about Erasmus and about similar accounts of misinformation that circulate to this day about Erasmus and his Greek New Testament. My article that I wrote for the Puritan Reformed Journal was titled Erasmus Anecdotes, and you can find it on my academia.edu page. And if you haven't seen that before, you can go to my blog at jeffriddle.net and you can find a link there to my academia.edu page where there are various book reviews and published articles that I've written. In that article, Erasmus Anecdotes, I examined and I think debunked several stories about Erasmus and his Greek New Testament. That New Testament first being published in 1516 and had a foundational role in the reception, recognition of the received text. And I wrote about the legends that continue to float about, especially among evangelical pastors and scholars who have embraced the modern critical text, and it seems like sometimes they want to justify their rejection of the traditional text by attacking Erasmus and his Greek New Testament. Some of the anecdotes that I wrote about in that article included the so-called rush to print legend and the rash wager legend. The rush to print is the idea that Erasmus's, especially his first edition, he had to rush to get it into print because he wanted to beat the Catholics in Spain who were working on the Complutensian polyglot. And because of that, the first edition was riddled with lots of errors and so forth because he had rushed to print. And I also looked at the rash wager anecdote or the rash wager legend. And this one is that Erasmus didn't have the Comma Ioanneum, 1 John 5, 7, in his first or second edition, but he included in the third edition. And the story began to circulate that he had, after he was criticized for it not being in the first two editions, he uttered a rash wager. If you can find any manuscript that has it, then I'll include it. And then supposedly a manuscript was manufactured for that very purpose. And it's called the rash wager legend or the rash wager anecdote. Well, in that article that I wrote, Erasmus Anecdotes, I drew on the work of the Dutch New Testament scholar Hank de Jong and the Oxford Erasmian scholar M.A. Screech, both of whom point out that these scholarly legends, the rush to print and the rash wager anecdote about Erasmus, seem to have emerged in the 19th century in order to fuel the effort to undermine and topple the Textus Receptus. And so a lot of times these things are mentioned in secondary literature. There's never really a primary source for it. And so there were these anecdotes, stories about Erasmus that circulated and still do today. Again, you can read my article on my academia.edu page if you're interested in the Erasmus legends or the Erasmus anecdotes. So, what I have observed is that there's a very similar phenomenon that often takes place with regard to the person and the work of F.H.A. Scrivener in the 19th century. Most especially is sometimes suggested, usually by those who most passionately oppose the traditional Protestant text, that Scrivener's TR is illegitimate. And they'll suggest it's illegitimate for various reasons, especially because it is said by these opponents that Scrivener supposedly back translated or reverse engineered his Greek New Testament from the King James Version. And so he made his Greek text simply agree verbatim, word for word, with the King James Version. And so this is what I would call the back translation or the reverse engineering legend or anecdote about F.H.A. Scrivener. I actually addressed some of these issues when I was at the Kept Pure in All Ages conference in Reedsburg, Wisconsin in 2022 in a lecture in a series I was doing there. And what I'm going to do in this series on my podcast is, after some introductory remarks, I'm simply going to be sharing 3 clips from that lecture. So I'll try also just to include a link to the entire lecture that I gave there in Wisconsin in 2022. But I'm just going to be extracting 3 clips about Scrivener. In that lecture, I addressed this issue, this anecdote of the back translation or the reverse engineering of Scrivener's TR. And I quoted the popular internet apologist James White, who made this claim and continues to make this claim about Scrivener's TR. And I also quoted YouTuber Dwayne Green, who has also repeated what I believe is a false narrative about Scrivener and his Greek New Testament. And this was brought to my mind again here recently because earlier this year, Stephen Steele, a Presbyterian minister in Scotland and an outspoken and ardent critic of the traditional Protestant text, repeated some of the same statements about Scrivener. He repeated the reverse engineered text anecdote. And so I thought it would be helpful to revisit some of the things that I said in that lecture in 2022. And again, to do this in 3 parts. One episode, this one is going to be a little biography of Scrivener himself. The second one is going to be about his Greek New Testament that he compiled in 1880 and published in 1881. And the third one is going to take head on the notion that his Greek New Testament was a back translation. And in that lecture, which I'm going to share again here, I gave very specific examples to illustrate how this is not true. And it's a form of bearing false witness to go around saying that Scrivener back translated or reverse engineered his text to match up with the King James Version. It's simply not true. And I think if you listen to my lecture and the clips that I'm going to be showing, you'll see that that's the case. Now, I've responded to Stephen Steele. I've had some interactions with him in the past. Some of you may remember I did a couple of podcasts responding to another online article that he had done about how the Protestant Orthodox looked at Codex Alexandrinus and in particular about the bibliology of Thomas Goodwin. Um, Steele was making the argument that Goodwin, based on four passages culled from his collected works, that he basically had a modern critical text view. And I think I demonstrated through looking at the primary sources that this isn't the case, that Thomas Goodwin, like other Protestant Orthodox men of his era, saw a common Protestant text and drew upon the traditional Protestant text that was used by the men of that era. I have to say, I want to confess that I find it very tedious to respond to Stephen Steele. It took a lot of work to do those two rejoinders that I did to him in Word Magazine 295 and Word Magazine 305. And I think this is the case because, um, in my humble opinion, there were so many, I think, factual errors, misrepresentations, misunderstandings, straw men, that it's daunting to try to take on something that approaches the topic from such a perspective where we have such differing views, but also there's such a fundamentally different interpretation of the data and the information. And again, I think there's faulty analysis of the information. A friend of mine, we were talking about this, suggested this analogy. He said, imagine if someone went into a room and that person was given 5 minutes to do as much damage as he could possibly do to the content of that room. So he could overturn tables, he could pull down curtains, he can rip up the rug, he can break furniture. A lot of damage can be done in a short period of time or in a short article. In just 5 minutes, a lot of damage can be done. And then think about in this analogy, this parable, after this person goes into this room and wreaks havoc for 5 minutes, they say, well, you're allowed 5 minutes to come in and clean up the mess he's made. Obviously, it can take hours to clean up uh, something that is done in 5 minutes. And so, a lot of times with these types of articles, it's hard to justify taking the time to respond to them. You hope that people have enough discernment to see some of the problems in the reasoning. And I feel this way about a good number of people who are critics of the TR position. I do appreciate some people who I think approach it fairly, even handedly. However, with all due respect, I have not found that to be the case with Steele. Steele's online article was generally about what he called textual criticism in the Free Church Fathers. So he's in Scotland and he was writing about uh, the Scottish Protestant ministers of the 19th century. And he was pointing out in this article overall that many of them were embracing some of the what was being presented to them at the time as the assured results of modern textual criticism. Some of them were saying, oh, well, we can take these insights from modern textual criticism and it can reshape our view of the text of scripture. And so that's really the overall thrust of his article. It wasn't about Scrivener, although as we'll see, he made some comments about Scrivener in the beginning, which I think again is perpetuating a false narrative about uh, back translation or reverse engineering. Um, but I think the problem with this article overall is that Steele, although he is, I think, has studied history at the graduate level, church history, I think doesn't have a grasp on the fact, well, of course, that's when you would find Protestant ministers who would be interacting with, in many cases, embracing modern textual criticism. It was the new thing that was being embraced. And a lot of people, from an apologetic perspective, felt like they had to incorporate this. B.B. Warfield would be an example of this in the United States. a confessional man who felt like he was being forced intellectually to deal with issues that were being put forward out of modern textual criticism, challenges to the stability, integrity, authenticity of the text. And I saw someone on Twitter or X recommend Steele's article, and I responded to that person's post, and I said, the 19th century is precisely the time when one would expect to find scholarly clergy toppling the TR under the weight of the so-called assured results of modern textual criticism. And then I asked, what has been the fruit in Scotland? What was the result of even these many otherwise godly men, pastors in the 19th century, embracing modern textual criticism when you look back at it, 150 years after the fact? And the results overall have not been great for the spiritual health of Scotland. Now, this person that I responded to, he pushed back and he said, but these men were conservative. They were conservative. They're showing you could be a conservative man and embrace modern textual criticism. And if you don't mind, I'll read what I responded to that on Twitter, on X. I responded, agreed that these men cannot be accused of liberalism. But unless we are going to engage in hagiography, we must also see them as men of their age, affected by the contemporary trends of their times, even as we are. It is by no means astonishing that all these men were impacted by the influences of modern textual criticism. B.B. Warfield would be a parallel in the United States, articulating inerrancy over infallibility in defending the doctrine of inspiration from the attacks of modernism. But his reinterpretations of Reformed bibliology in this defense had unintended consequences. See Theodore Letis's analysis. I would not, of course, place all the blame for the steep decline of outward expression of the faith in Scotland, where apparently 51% of the population now say they have no religion, on accommodation to the spirit of the age on this issue. But neither would I dismiss it as completely inconsequential. The undermining of the integrity of Scripture, inherent in the rise of modern historical criticism, including modern textual criticism, undoubtedly contributed to what sociologist and philosopher Charles Taylor would call disenchantment, and contributed to the rise of the so-called secular age. And that's the end of my Twitter response. How weird is it when you're quoting yourself on Twitter? Okay, excuse me for that. Um, the post by Steele reminded me of an article with a similar spirit and intent that was posted to the Evangelical Textual Criticism blog in 2024. And it made a similar argument relating to the 19th century Southern Baptist theologian John Broadus. Broadus lived from 1827 to 1895. And there's an article there about John Broadus on New Testament textual criticism. And I never responded to that, but I had exactly the same thought when I looked at Steele's article on the Scottish ministers of the 19th century. The 19th century is precisely the time when we would expect to find men encountering the influences of modern textual criticism. It affected Warfield, it affected Spurgeon, it affected even R.L. Dabney. The question, though, is not what men in the 19th century had to say, but what was being said in the 16th and 17th centuries, and was there a shift? And yes, there was. And that's the point. So that's a little bit about the overall issue with Steele's article, although I'm not really addressing that in this podcast. What I want to focus in on is just something he says, some things he says, a couple of paragraphs in his introduction, and they have to do with Scrivener. And so he has a couple of paragraphs there, And in my humble opinion, there are some misunderstandings, misrepresentations of Scrivener. There's some straw manning. He seems to be saying that everyone in the confessional text position lionizes Scrivener, and he points out that Scrivener had questions about the Comma Ioanneum, and so he's kind of saying, "See, the Scrivener didn't even hold to the confessional text, and yet these guys hold him up and they use his translation." And you'll see when I play this clip today that in 2022, I pointed out that we are not claiming that Scrivener had the ideal bibliology. We are not claiming that FHA Scrivener held our view of the confessional text. Scribner was influenced by the rise of modern textual criticism. Also, he was not reformed. He was not confessionally reformed. He did not hold to the Westminster Confession of Faith or the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. He was an Anglican, and he was approaching the text of Scripture, I think, in a way that was fitting with his confession. He had a lot of respect for the traditional Protestant text and especially for the authorized version. But he did not hold the bibliology of Westminster Confession of Faith 1:8. We can admire, however, and use his work even if we were not in full agreement with him with respect to bibliology. We can use his edition of the Greek New Testament without suggesting that he agreed with the confessional text position or we agree with his position in all points. And there's a kind of a parallel thing that could be said as to how we look at Erasmus. I think actually Steele does this in this article. He says, but Erasmus was a Catholic. Yeah, well, everybody, in 1516 in Western Europe was Catholic. Luther doesn't nail the 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg until October 31, 1517. So this is another kind of thing that sometimes people do who want to attack the traditional Protestant text. They'll say, well, Erasmus was a Catholic. Scrivener didn't hold uh, a Reformed bibliology. Well, we're not claiming that we agree with Erasmus on everything. We're not claiming that we agree with Scrivener on everything, but we're appreciating what in God's providence they produced. Printed editions of the Greek New Testament that reflect the true text, the Protestant text, the text that was a basis for our classic Protestant translations. In addition, Steele also attempts to downplay what appears to be the conservative role that Scrivener played on the revision committee that was commissioned by the convocation at Canterbury. He served on that committee, yes, alongside Westcott and Hort, but most of the persons who were contemporary observers of that when it was going on describe him as having been a sort of ballast against the progressive challenges to the traditional texts that were being put forward by Westcott and Hort. Um, Scribner supported the traditional ending of Mark. He supported the woman taken in adultery. He had questions about the Comma Ioanneum, but in general, he's supporting the traditional Protestant text, and he's serving again as a ballast on that committee. In general, he was, holding to the traditional text, and his biographers from his own era and the era just after who wrote about him, several of whom I cite in this lecture, seem uniformly to recognize that he was a traditionalist, he was a conservative, and he played this conservative counterbalancing role on the committee. His production of a printed edition of the Textus Receptus was intentional. He could have provided merely a list of ways in which the English Revised Version, that English translation that revision committee produced, he could have just had a simple list of where it departed from the traditional text. Instead, he produced a printed edition of the TR in the same year, published in the same year, 1881, that Westcott and Hort would publish their modern critical text. And I don't think that was by accident. And Steele seems to want to downplay the inherent conservatism of Scrivener. Steele is critical also of the Trinitarian Bible Society. He has a lot of sometimes even caustic criticism of TBS and also of the Grange Press, which has published the Reader's Edition of the TR. And he criticizes them for not including the original preface and the appendix that Scrivener had in his 1881 edition. And we'll deal with this when we get to part two. But my question back is, why should they print these things? Because that the Scrivener's 1881 edition was done as part of this revision committee work, and it had notations about where in the traditional text that the English Revised Version had departed from it. And the English Revised Version is no longer in print. Why would it make sense for TBS or Grange Press to print that extraneous material when what they're really interested in is the text itself? And in fact, that's the way Scrivener laid it out. He had his preface, he had the text itself, and he had the appendix. And so what we're most interested in today is the text itself. And so that's not a problem for TBS, Trinitarian Bible Society, or for Grange Press, that they're just making use of his text. That's the most important part of his published uh, work of the Greek New Testament. Worst of all, though, I think, Steele repeats, as I've already said, the so-called back translation or reverse engineering myth. And I think by the time if you listen to all three parts in this series, especially the third one, you'll realize that it's a false narrative to say that Scrivener reverse engineered his Greek New Testament from the King James Version. Steele explicitly says in this article that Scrivener's TR is, quote, a reverse engineered Greek text based on the text critical choices of an English translation, the King James Version, end quote. Well, we will get to put that statement to the test, and we will get to that by part three. So again, this is going to be a three-part series. This is part one, where I'm just going to look at the life of F.H.A. Scrivener. Who was this man? When did he live? What did he care about? What did he give himself to? Then part two is going to be looking at Scrivener's Greek New Testament, breaking it down, how he compiled it in 1880, published it in 1881, subsequent uh, printings of it, and also what were the parts of it, the preface, the text itself, the appendix. How did he create it? Was it, as Dwayne Green criticized Scrivener for not doing modern textual criticism, for not going back and comparing manuscripts and so forth? Was Scrivener doing something that was odd, arcane for what was being done in critical scholarship in his time? We'll examine that in part two. And then in part three, we'll get down to the nitty gritty. Did Scrivener back translate or reverse engineer his Greek New Testament from the King James Version? So for now, I'm just going to start playing this in a moment. I'm not going to come back on at the end, so I'll have to bid my farewells now. In this first clip, I give some introduction to the topic, talk a little bit about the charge of reverse engineering. Again, this was a larger lecture. And then I'll move on to the part of the lecture where I just give a brief biographical sketch of Scrivener. Hope this will be helpful to those who are listening. And I'll turn it over to myself now. And I'll hope to speak to you in the next episode of Word Magazine. Till then, take care, and may the Lord richly bless you. And the first thing I want to address is a very practical matter, namely the claim that is made by some
that Scrivener's TR, which is the standard TR used by most people who hold to the confessional text, that text was back translated into Greek from the King James Version. This argument, I believe, is often made in an attempt to dissuade ordinary pastors and ordinary Christians from embracing the confessional text. And that's why it's coming in this lecture, because that argument is often made to dissuade ordinary believers. Most times it's going to be given to that. Then secondly, hopefully if time allows, I want to address the charge that confessional bibliology promotes a dangerous view in conflict with the teaching of the Bible itself, that we are textual absolutists. I want to look at that charge. Is it wrong or spiritually unhealthy to want a Bible in which one may have the highest degree of trust and certainty? Is that a vice rather than a virtue? So let's begin, though, the one that's going to take the most time. And that's responding to the claim that Scrivener's TR, again, this edition, which generally serves in our contemporary context as a standard printed edition of the TR that's used today, was it back translated from the King James Version into Greek? The popular internet apologist James White, in a video lecture from January the 4th of 2019 at Covenant Baptist Seminary, held up Scrivener's TR, and he had the nice blue one. He didn't have the black covered one here. And as he is prone to do, he said, quote, "This is a Greek text based on an English translation called the King James Version." White later adds, "So this is the King James New Testament in Greek." YouTuber Dwayne Green posted a video to his channel on October the 14th of 2021 titled, "Why Scrivener Reverse Engineered the Textus Receptus." In that video, Green begins his presentation as follows. Quote, "If you have purchased yourself a TR, chances are you have the 1881 version that Scrivener had put together. And if you have the 1881 version that Scrivener put together, did you know that you're using a reverse-engineered Textus Receptus?" End quote. He continues, quote, "So the 1881 text of the TR has actually been sort of, I don't want to say back translated, but you could almost say back translated from the King James Version. So what happened was that when Scrivener was doing his work on the text, he was actually trying to get the TR to match the exact wording of the King James Version. So what he had done, unlike most textual critics, when you're trying to put together a New Testament, you consult individual manuscripts and you compare readings and you figure out which one is more likely to be authentic, and you put that in the text." End quote. Notice the claims. Scrivener's TR was back translated from the King James Version. It follows the exact wording of the King James Version. And it's a bad text because it did not consult individual manuscripts. So that's what we're going to look at. I'm going to get to that, but to give us a little bit of background, because obviously, again, maybe some people before never heard the word Scrivener. Okay, so the Scrivener text is the one that's typically used today, published by the Trinitarian Bible Society. I want to begin by telling you a little bit about F.H.A. Scrivener, who lived from 1813 to 1891. My primary source is the entry on Scrivener written by E.C. Marchant in the Dictionary of National Biography, volume 51, written in 1897. Frederick Henry Ambrose Scrivener was born on September the 29th of 1813 in London to Ambrose and Harriet Scholl Scrivener. His father was a stationer, a paper merchant. In July of 1831, he entered Trinity College, Cambridge, where he earned the BA degree in 1835 and the MS degree in 1838. On July 21, 1840, he married Anne Blofeld. In his professional career, he served both as a schoolmaster and as a Church of England cleric. From 1846 to 1856, he served as the headmaster of the Falmouth School in Cornwall. Marchant notes that in addition to teaching and ministry, quote, Scrivener devoted his life to the study of the New Testament, end quote. In 1845, he wrote a work titled A Supplement to the Authorized English Version of the New Testament. His first important scholarly publication was a collation of 20 gospel manuscripts in 1853. In 1861, he published his landmark work titled A Plain Introduction to the Criticism of the New Testament for the Use of Biblical Students. That was the Metzgers, really, of the 19th century. A second edition was produced in 1874, a third edition in 1883, and a fourth posthumous edition was edited by Edward Miller. In 1864, he published his collation of the Sinaiticus and Codex Bezae. He produced the Cambridge Paragraph Bible of the Authorized Version in 8 volumes from 1870 to 1878. He published 6 lectures on the text of the New Testament in 1874, and his work Adversia Critica Sacra was also published after his death. Late in his career, his contributions to the field of biblical studies was universally acknowledged in his homeland. Quite notably, he served on the revision committee for the English Bible formed at the Convocation at Canterbury from 1870 to 1882. This was the committee that ended up trying to revise the King James Version and producing really the first rival to the King James Version, the English Revised Version. And Westcott and Hort were also on this committee, and from it they produced the first modern critical text that really challenged and attempted to topple the preeminence of the Textus Receptus. Well, he was on that committee. In Frederick G. Kenyon's 1909 article, English Versions for the Dictionary of the Bible, edited by James Hastings, Kenyon suggests that while Westcott and Hort exercised immense influence on the committee, there were conservative voices that offered resistance to many of the changes promoted by the committee. He makes special mention of Scrivener, whom he describes as, quote, taking a less advanced view of the necessity of changes to the received text, end quote. We do not want inaccurately to suggest that Scrivener would have agreed wholly with the perspective of contemporary confessional bibliology. He was not reformed in his theologies from the Church of England. It's clear, though, that he took a more conservative approach to the Scriptures. Scrivener was no doubt influenced by the currents of modern textual criticism as it aggressively pressed its case in the late 19th century. We see that same influence even on someone like Spurgeon. One can simply review Scrivener's entries on various disputed texts in his plain introduction to see the influence of modern textual criticism. Nevertheless, he also clearly had a love for the Authorized Version and an impulse to defend the traditional underlying text on which it was based. In the opening pages of his plain introduction, for example, Scrivener makes reference to the traditional ending of Mark and the Pericope Adulterae, calling them weighty passages. He then adds the following, quote, we shall hereafter defend these passages, the first, meaning the traditional ending of Mark, without the slightest misgiving, the second to a high degree of probability, as entitled to be regarded authentic portions of the Gospels in which they stand, end quote. In 1872, Scrivener was granted a civil pension in recognition of his services in connection with biblical criticism. In 1874, he became prebendary. Not sure exactly what that office means, but it's an honorary canon office. And he was given this office at Exeter. In 1872, he received the honorary LL.D. Doctor of Law degree from St. Andrews University. And in 1876, the honorary D.C.L. Doctor of Civil Law degree from Oxford. In 1876, he received the vicarage of Hendon, Middlesex, In 1884, he suffered a paralytic stroke, perhaps hastened by his fevered work a year earlier to complete the third edition of his plain introduction, and he lived in ill health till his death in 1891. Marchant, his biographer, in his 1897 sketch of Scrivener's life, concludes the article with these words, quote, "Scrivener held firmly to the traditional text of the New Testament, declining to accept the theories of modern critics as to the comparative lateness of the Textus Receptus." And then he says, his arguments have not found general support as against those of Westcott and Hort, end quote.